When it comes to the Netherlands, there is a long history of naval endeavours. Right from the start of the Dutch Republic, its naval services were crucial in ensuring its independence from Spain. Later on, it was crucial in keeping the British and other forces out of the Dutch Republic, and indeed in setting up what was the largest international trading company in the VOC throughout the 17th century. It may not come as a surprise then that during the Second World War, when the Netherlands was invaded by Germany and also fought against Japan, the Navy also played a role, albeit not one that you might expect. They fought both at home in the Netherlands and indeed abroad, particularly in the Pacific Ocean, as well as in a few other fronts. So that's what I'd like to look at in today's video. What did the Dutch Navy do in the Second World War? If you want to find out more about the Dutch Navy in the Second World War, a great and fun way to do this is through World of Warships, which is coming to PC as well. This is because World of Warships has a range of different ships from the Second World War from a host of different nations, including from the Netherlands. So several of the ships I'll be talking about later in the video also feature in World of Warships. And as well as having fearsome vessels from the Second World War, it also has those from the First World War. New content is added every month. These include new ships, in-game nations, cosmetics, and whole ship classes. Multiple ship classes are there that you can choose from, ranging all the way from the big hitting battleships to the faster and devastating destroyers and cruisers, as well as submarines and aircraft carriers. The community is incredibly active and engaged, and there are many different forums and Discord channels to take part in, as well as tournaments that are hosted by the organizers. The great thing about World of Warships is that it's available on multiple consoles, not just on PC, as you can see. And indeed, if you want to get the chance to fight on some of these incredible naval battlefields, or battle seas, I suppose, of the Second World War, the First World War, then there's a special offer for viewers of this channel. If they go down to the description below, you will find the link to download World of Warships, and there is a special promo code that appears on the screen now, which is the code WARSHIPS to get exclusive rewards, including a bunch of doubloons, credits, premier account time, and a free ship after you complete 15 battles. So it's free real estate. Get down there, get into the description, and check out World of Warships to support the channel and have a great time blasting away on the seven seas. At the outbreak of hostilities in the Netherlands in 1940, the Dutch Navy consisted of around 5 cruisers, 4 coastal defence vessels, 5 armoured gunboats, and 11 destroyers. Now, many more ships were being constructed at this time, as from 1939, with hostilities seeming to be on the rise in Europe, the Dutch government decided to lay plans to greatly enhance the Navy. However, by the time the war started, most of these ships had not even passed the planning stage, and so others were still half completed in the harbour and so could not take part in any conflict at that point. The Great Depression had hit the Netherlands hard in the 1930s, and so it was deemed that money was more essential to be spent elsewhere. Furthermore, during the First World War, the Netherlands had maintained its neutrality, and its neutrality had largely been respected, apart from a British blockade on the Netherlands who refused to stop trading with the Germans, against whom they were fighting at that point. However, it came too little too late when those reforms in the Navy were implemented and more ships were demanded. The war would start already on the 10th of May 1940, and of course, due to the nature of the attack coming from Germany and the geography of the Netherlands, the Navy itself would only play a minor role in the defence of the Netherlands as the German forces advanced. However, we shouldn't skip over it for that reason, because members of the Dutch Navy would see action in the defence of the Netherlands. Several of these would be in the form of German strikes by the Luftwaffe against the ships which were at port. So the destroyers Van Galen and the destroyer escort Christian Cornelis were both sunk in the harbour of Rotterdam, as well as the gunboats Johan Maurits and Friso, the mine-laying vessels of Hydra and Bulgia, and the minesweeper M3. As the German advance proved inexorable over the coming days, several other vessels were destroyed by their own personnel. This involved the submarine O-12, the destroyer escorts Z3 and G16, both of which were already obsolete by this time, the gunboats of Brinio, Braga, Helfring, and Freyr, all of which were also river boats and fairly obsolete by this point as well, and various other minesweepers that were in the harbour and they didn't want to fall into German hands. Several others would actually be captured by the Germans in the harbour. These included the obsolete gunboats of Tyr and Balder, as well as Hada and Thor, both of which didn't actually have any guns on them, so weren't of particular importance, as well as several smaller crafts like the Vidar, a mine-laying vessel, and two obsolete submarines, the O8 and the O11. Several others were captured by the Germans, as I mentioned before, which were still under construction at that point. So there was the cruiser De Zeven Provinciën, which ended up not being used, as well as the cruiser of the Eendracht. The destroyers of Tjerk-Hiddes, Gerard Kalenburg and Philips van Almonde were all damaged but were able to be repaired by the Kriegsmarine, and these were then given German names and taken over by the Kriegsmarine, as well as the submarines of O-25, O-26 and O-27, which were assigned to various U-boat wolf packs and would fight against Allied shipping in the North Sea. There would be some action seen where the Marines were quite successful, and this was in the city of Rotterdam on the river Maas, where the Germans were advancing from the south and had to cross over to get into what was known as Fortress Holland, using several of the bridges, the Maasbruggen as they're called, which were defended by Dutch soldiers, comprised of both the standard infantry conscripts of the army and indeed of various naval units as well. They were actually also supported by one of the vessels that was stationed in the harbour, which gave supporting gunfire. Although when Luftwaffe planes arrived and bombed them, they were forced to retreat, having lost 3 men killed in action and the propeller being seriously damaged. This meant that the Marines, or the Koninklijke Marine, were now on their own, but they continued to fight against the German advances, halting them there on the rivers for several more days. On the 13th of May, a general counterattack was ordered, and several troops of Marines listing in the small hundreds, as well as naval auxiliary units, were put into action once again, in some of the most determined fighting that was seen in the Netherlands against the German forces. Even though they were eventually forced to surrender, their actions went down in history and indeed in Dutch folklore as being some of the bravest fighting that was seen, and they even earned their own nickname that has gone down in legend. One of the last of these defenders of the bridge died in 2018. He was called Bill Raamakers, and he was given several military honours for his service to the Dutch Navy and indeed the Dutch Marine Corps. It was said that the Germans dubbed them with the title of Die Schwarzen Teufel, or the Black Devils, because of the dark blue or black colour of their coats that they wore, as well as the blackened expressions that they had on their faces, based on all of the fire and the smoke that had gone on during these battles. They were completely blackened. Although this story has been told many times, it's not sure if this actually ever was said at the time, as this was much mythologized after the fact. But it's clear that this was one of the most effective and dogged points of resistance against German attack. The Germans, however, would succeed in flattening Rotterdam to the ground, using a huge amount of their air force in the Blitz of Rotterdam. And eventually the Dutch would be forced to surrender, to capitulate to the German advance, which they did several days later. But many of the naval ships that were at harbour that were able to get to England and so not fall into German hands. And one of these ships, also very importantly, brought the Dutch royal family with them to London, where they would have the Dutch government in exile, overseeing several resistance operations from there. Furthermore, the ships that escaped from the Netherlands joined into Royal Naval Service, the British having a respect for the Dutch fighting and the Dutch naval tradition, and indeed incorporating them immediately into the Royal Navy, where some of them would receive British crews, while others continued with their original Dutch crews, now fighting under the British as part of a lease of these naval ships. As part of this, several Junkers and other aircraft that were attached to the Navy were also formed into their own RAF squadron, together with several Belgian units, the 320 Squadron, that would fight in various engagements alongside the RAF. While the Battle of the Netherlands was over, that was not the only responsibility of the Dutch Navy in 1940, as a large part of the East Asian island chain that is now Indonesia was under Dutch control as part of the Dutch East Indies. And starting already in the 1930s, Japanese imperial ambition was threatening Dutch colonial rule there. And so the Dutch, starting from the 1930s, the late 1930s, were already aware that they may at some point have to fight with the Japanese to protect the Indies from their ambitions. And so this is what the Dutch would do. The Japanese Navy, however, was far larger than the Dutch Navy at that point and far more advanced. They had many heavy cruisers and heavy destroyers, these having guns that could shoot further and penetrate deeper than the Dutch weapons of the same time, and indeed of most the Allied shipping that was available in these colonial waters of the Pacific. The Allies' first direct taste of Japanese superiority in naval and air combat would of course come with Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. The Allies banded together in the start of 1942 to create what would become known as ABDA, standing for the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command Force, which was an effort by all the Allied nations to band their spread out naval and aerial forces together to launch counteroffensives against the Japanese and to stop their thrusts against various other targets that were colonies of the British and the Dutch, particularly the Dutch East Indies and Singapore. Now, the first overall commander was Admiral Hart, who was an American, but he was later replaced by a Dutchman who I've actually talked about a lot in my video about him. He was called Konrad Helfrich, and indeed, if you want to find out about Dutch submarines, particularly in the Pacific, and their effectiveness, especially in the early days when Konrad Helfrich took over control of ABDA, then you can watch that video there. Unlike Hart, who had been very cautious and actually avoided a lot of battles in order to consolidate and maintain the numbers of ships that the Allies had, Helfrich's approach was far more aggressive. He thought that the Japanese had been given too much free rein to attack at will and decided to launch counterattacks, particularly to try and stop invading forces of the Japanese. Of course, the nature of the Pacific was very different to the war in Europe, and so everywhere the Japanese were attacking in the Malay Barrier and the Indies, they had to get to with invasion fleets. So his idea was to stop these fleets themselves from attacking, and so to stop the Japanese advance in that way. There's actually from a Time article that was published on the 23rd of February 1942, just after Helfrich had become overall commander of ABDA, which shows some of the enthusiasm for his methods, at least at that point. It reads, "The Helfrich plan is simple and direct, based upon a minute knowledge of Indies waters, to strike and strike again and again at the Japanese supply lines. For most of his naval life, Java-born Admiral Helfrich has done nothing but study war with the Japanese. His navy was designed for shifty, aggressive action within the narrow East Indian waters. In the first 54 days of war, his ships and cooperating Dutch planes sank 54 Japanese vessels. Ship a day Helfrich, the Dutch soon called him. His ideas dominated the enlarging and equipping of Java's main naval base at Surabaya, where heavy cruisers, but not battleships, can be fueled and repaired. For the Helfrich plan to succeed, Surabaya must be held." So the main aim was to stop the Japanese fleet from being able to deploy invading forces on the Indonesian islands. And so command was given of the fleet itself to Admiral Karel Doorman from his flagship De Ruyter. He would lead a joint force of British, Dutch, American and Australian vessels against the Japanese invasion fleets in several battles in February and March of 1942, when they were attacking Makassar. He would then lead another, unfortunately unsuccessful counteroffensive against the Japanese invasion of Bali in the Badung Strait battles. But the battle in which he would be most famous and which was most destructive was the Battle of the Java Sea, when the Japanese were threatening Java itself. ABDA's strike force at the Battle of the Java Sea consisted of the following Dutch ships: the cruisers HN-LMS Java, the HN-LMS Tromp, and the HN-LMS De Ruyter, which was also Karel Doorman's flagship, as well as the hunter destroyers, the HN-LMS Kortenaar, the HN-LMS Witte de Wit, and the HN-LMS Piet Hein. There were also the following Australian ships: the cruisers HMAS Perth and the HMAS Hobart. The Americans provided the heavy cruiser of the USS Houston and the 4 destroyers, the Alden, John D. Edwards, John D. Fords, and the USS Paul Jones. The British, in contrast, also supplied a heavy cruiser, the HMS Exeter, which before had been involved in the sinking of the Graf Spee, the famous German battleship, and they also provided to this battle the destroyers HMS Electra, HMS Encounter, and HMS Jupiter. However, this force was seriously weakened already before the actual start of the Battle of the Java Sea, because 2 of the American cruisers and a Dutch cruiser, as well as a number of destroyers, were heavily damaged, with the Dutch HMS Piet Hein actually being sunk before the battle proper started. So in the end, there were only actually 5 cruisers, 2 Dutch ones and 1 from each of the other nations that were left in the forward group, as well as 3 cruisers that were in reserve but a great distance behind them. So this much weakened force then still went ahead to engage the Japanese fleet despite being at a disadvantage. The Japanese fleet, in contrast, consisted of the 5th cruiser fleet. The Japanese fleet consisted of 2 heavy cruisers, the Nachi and the Haguro, 1 light cruiser, the Jientsu, and 16 destroyers, including the Hatsukaze, Yukikaze, Amatsukaze, Tokitsukaze, Ushio, Sazanami, Yamikaze, and Kawakaze. These were all commanded by the Admiral Shoji Nishimura. And as mentioned previously, the Japanese heavy cruisers that they had outranged the Allied fleet in terms of both of their guns and crucially also the torpedoes that they were armed with. On the 27th of February 1942, contact was made with the Japanese, and the Japanese opened fire. The Exeter was hit almost straight away, with a critical round landing in the engine room, disabling 6 of 8 boilers instantly. As a result of this, the strongest Allied unit that they had to leave the battle earlier and took the Dutch destroyer Witte de With to return to Surabaya. At the same time, one of the Dutch destroyers was hit by a long-lance torpedo and sunk after breaking in 2. At the same time, the cruiser De Ruyter, on which Karel Doorman, the admiral, was stationed, received a 20-centimeter round in the engine room, which caused significant damage. Despite the damages to not only his own ship but the fleet, Admiral Doorman decided not to give up, as he knew that turning the fleet back meant another successful Japanese landing, which was something that his policy under his superior Helfrich had been explicit in trying to avoid. It's at this point that he sent out possibly one of the most famous phrases in Dutch naval history, "Ik val aan, volg mij," meaning "I'm attacking, follow me." This was followed by a second command issued for clarification, which was "All ships follow me." And with this command, he ploughed ahead towards the Japanese fleet to enter into proper range and engage them in combat. Now, with this engagement, most of the ships under his command would be raked with fire and destroyed. Whilst inflicting some losses on the Japanese, they were unable to sink any of the Japanese ships due to the distinction in the armour of the Japanese heavy cruisers as opposed to the light and medium caliber guns of the strike force itself. 4 of the American destroyers were sent back because of a lack of fuel, torpedoes and ammunition, and they would be the only survivors of the battle, apart from those that had retreated to Surabaya earlier. A second British destroyer, HMS Electra, would receive a lethal blow from a Japanese cruiser volley. And at this point, there were only 4 Allied cruisers alone fighting against the Japanese, as all the accompanying destroyers had either returned to port or been sunk. It had started to grow dark at this point, and the Allied fleet had no airplanes with which to light up the enemy with flares, something that the enemy did have, and so the enemy received another advantage against the Allied fleet. It's at around 11 o'clock that the real disaster struck, which is that the Dutch cruiser De Ruyter and the American cruiser the Houston received hits from the Japanese cruiser guns. It was at this point that the other Dutch cruiser that was still there, the Java, was hit by 2 long-lance torpedoes and sank very rapidly to the bottom. Just minutes later, the cruiser De Ruyter, where Karel Doorman was taking command, was also hit by a long-lance torpedo. It would remain floating for some time, but it was clear that she was sinking. Karel Doorman gave the command to abandon the ship, but he decided that as the captain, he would go down with his ship, and so he and the other officers went down with the ship while the others evacuated. Around 850 men drowned on those 2 Dutch cruisers, despite the order to evacuate the ship. The Australian and the American cruiser broke off from the fight, realizing that they were not able to break through the Japanese armor and that the day had been lost. However, they would also not escape, because the next day they also would be sunk by Japanese ships. So all 5 of the cruisers that had set sail with Admiral Doorman had been sunk within a week of the battle. The Battle of Vijava Sea was thus a complete disaster for the Allies, and it would result in the complete abandonment of ABDA as it was essentially annihilated in one go by the Japanese Navy. Some have questioned the intelligence of Doorman in leading such an assault that in hindsight could never have succeeded given the difference in forces that were arrayed at the battle. Others, however, have highlighted the bravery of the action, to continue attacking even when things seemed hopeless, and to go down with his ship as it was the tradition for captains to do after they had been sunk. In any case, this didn't stop the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, and they were able to conquer all of the islands with relative ease in the end, despite the efforts of the ABDA to stop them at sea, and the Dutch, Australians, Americans, and of course many Indonesians included in that on land as well. That wouldn't be quite the end for the Dutch actually in the Pacific as they were fighting. And what's interesting is that by 2002, only a few of the wrecks of Dutch ships had actually been found in the Pacific, but then in 2003 and again in 2008 the site of the Battle of the Java Sea was successfully located, and many of the wrecks of the Dutch cruisers and destroyers was found, and indeed the bell of De Ruiter, so of Karel Doorman's flagship, was found and brought back, and here the King of the Netherlands, Willem-Alexander, is looking with several naval officials at the bell that was on his flagship, this infamous heroic figure in Dutch naval history who went down with the ship and his bell there. For the rest of the war, the remaining Dutch fleet would be based on Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, and as I mentioned in the video about the Dutch submarines, others would operate from Western Australia, particularly from Fremantle. One of the successes of the remaining navy was to keep the Dutch soldiers in Dutch New Guinea fighting alongside the Australians for another 11 or so months against the Japanese forces, which tied up troops there and stopped them being committed elsewhere. One of the only successes of ABDA in fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. If we move back to Europe, those Dutch ships that had made it to England were actually very important in taking part in the evacuation of troops from Dunkirk, as well as ships from many other nations and many British ships too. And then later on in the war, in being part of Allied convoys across the Atlantic. Several of these Dutch ships would also be sunk by the Luftwaffe and by mines and by U-boats in places as far afield as North Africa, the Pacific and the North Sea, as well as the Atlantic more generally. Several of these Dutch ships would also be involved in the D-Day landings, working alongside a host of Allied ships there. As we can see here is the Douwe Aukes, which was also involved in the D-Day landings that we can see. Now, of course, in 1945, the war would come to an end, but the Netherlands would find itself embroiled in another conflict. And actually, as part of this, some of the Dutch Marines would go to America to receive Marine training there, which they would soon put to use in the war in Indonesia, which I have a video about if you are interested. This war would pit the Dutch against several different factions vying for control over what had been the Dutch East Indies and had been taken over by the Japanese in 1945. For more on that, I have an entire dedicated video on what I've termed the Dutch-Vietnam War, as well as on how the Dutch created an army in 1945 to go and to fight there. So several of those who had fought in the Dutch Navy would be committed into the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, and several other places to fight there straight away after the war. But that is essentially the end of this video on the Dutch Navy in the Second World War. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been interesting. It's involved an awful lot of research on my part, and there are a few great sources that I would highly recommend checking out that I will put in the description below if you would like to find out a little bit more. So let me know if you enjoyed this topic and if you'd like anything more specific on these kinds of things. I'd be happy to look at some more topics about the Netherlands in the Second World War if you'd be interested in that, so please do let me know. There's another great channel I'd like to shout out, which is the channel History Hustle, which has both content in English and in Dutch. So I'll leave links to that in the description below. And please do also support the channel by checking out today's video sponsor, which is of course World of Warships, with the code WARSHIPS for an exclusive offer. Thanks for watching everyone. I have been Hilbert and this has been The History.